I want to show you today how to take a scrap piece of MDF and just an old scrap piece of black melamine and turn it into a beautiful tabletop that is going to fit perfectly on my desk. You're not going to want to miss this super easy, very simple technique to be able to make this happen. And it's all done using epoxy resin with no special tools. Hey everyone, welcome back to another day in Papa's workshop. Well, this desk I made a couple of months ago and it has been an absolutely fantastic addition to the shop. So much so that I want to be able to finally put on a permanent top onto this desk. Now this was a scrap piece of MDF that I had laying around the shop, and this was a piece of black melamine. Same thing. It was just a scrap piece laying around the shop. Well, today I'm going to take this, be able to put an edge on this and put an epoxy top on it that's going to make it look very, very professional and provide many years of service. In addition to that, I 3D printed a couple of drawers like this that I'm going to put right underneath here, and I'm going to show you how I attached it and how I printed these drawers. The first thing I want to do is patch these two holes. Now remember, this was just a scrap piece of the melamine. So in this example, I'm putting in the CA glue first down into the hole, which soaks the whole entire cavity. And then I'm taking the sawdust and packing it into the hole. And it's absorbing that CA glue. Now that's one method to be able to do it. The other method is to be able to take the sawdust and pack it into the hole first. And you want to shove as much sawdust into that hole as you possibly can. Once you have it completely full, then we're going to take the CA glue and put a few drops on it and let it soak into the sawdust. And then we'll just wipe off the excess. And then I'll just take the accelerator and just light spray, and that takes care of it. And those holes are filled. And the glue that I'm using is the Starbond Thin CA glue along with the accelerator. And don't forget, I have a discount code down in the description below so you can take advantage of that. But that hole are now filled. I'm going to take just a little bit of sandpaper. Now this is 150 grit, and just sand that down smooth because that was standing just a little bit proud and I want it flush with the surface of the material. On this scrap piece, it had the sharp edges on it, but on the one side, it had the 3/8 round over. So I'm going to use the 3/8 round over bit, and I'm going to do the entire top to match this all the way around. And I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom portion of the desk. And then when I flip this over and go to the bottom side, I want to use a 1/4 inch round over bit. That way the epoxy will be able to roll over the edge of the table top and then roll down and underneath. And yes, you'll still have some drips there, but it's much easier to be able to take care, remove those drips, and it gives a much nicer finished edge where you have the 3/8 round over and then you have a 1/4 inch round over. So I'm going to take this over to the router table and I'm going to do that operation now. You always want to double check to make sure you have the right side down. And this is that radius that's already there. So I'll put that face down, and then I can just cut over that just to make sure it's a nice smooth edge all the way around, and it transitions into the new part that hasn't been cut yet. Now as far as the fence is really there just to be able to act as a dust collection, because the roller bearing that's on top of the router bit is the actual guide that I'm using to be able to cut this radius on this material. And the dust collection system works extremely well, but you still need to wear a mask, and don't forget, wear the hearing protection also anytime you're using the power tools. Once this edge is completely cut, I want to look it over and make sure that it looks great, and it does. So I'll set this one aside and grab the black piece of the melamine and do the exact same thing. Once it's cut all the way around, same thing. I want to flip it over and inspect it to make sure that it looks really good. And you can see just how even and nice it looks on that raw edge of the MDF and that melamine. So this looks great. So I'm happy with this. It's time to change the bit Then I'll repeat the process with that 1/4 inch round over bit on the bottom side of each of these tops. Once finished at the router table, it's back to the workbench. I'm taking 220 grit sandpaper and I want to sand the surface of each of these tops. I want to be able to make sure that it's completely smooth before adding the paint. And yes, I want to sand the melamine top as well. Same 220 grit paper, and what this does is actually create a mechanical bond between the melamine surface itself and the paint. And then I'll sand the painted surface to be able to do the same thing, create a mechanical bond between the paint and the epoxy. The next step is to put down some plastic on the workbench so we don't get paint on it. And I'm just using a couple of trash bags. And then I'm also setting up these little standoffs. That way I can paint both sides of the tops at the same time. Now I'm going to paint the bottom side first, flip it over, set it back on these little stands, and then I'll paint the top side. That way I can go from painting to be able to sand the top and start the epoxy all in one step, because the bottom will already be painted and I don't need to do anything else to the bottom at this point. You can use just about any type of paint that you want to use. Now I'm using a semi-gloss black paint by Glidden, but you can use, like I said, just about any paint. I'm using this because, quite frankly, it's the only black that I have, and it works real well with a semi-gloss finish. Now if you have a black primer, that will work really well also. So again, it just depends on what paint that you have in the shop. It doesn't have to be all that fancy or special. Use what you have. To mix the resin and protect the tabletop, I'm using this silicone mat by Resin. This has proved to be a very good, effective mat to be able to use in the shop. I absolutely love it. After the paint completely dries, you want to sand it with 200 grit paper just to be able to smooth everything out, rough up the surface to be able to create a mechanical bond between the painted surface and the epoxy resin. Then it's time to mix the resin itself. You have plenty of working time. There is no need to rush this part. But after I mix these two parts together, you have about a 45-minute working time. To calculate how much resin that you need, it's real simple. You only need to use about 3 ounces per square foot to be able to do this. So I've got this mixed up and I'm going to use a black dye, and it only takes just a tiny little bit. But the first thing I'm doing is putting all this resin into one bucket and I can mix it thoroughly. Now this black dye is actually by aluminite that I've had on hand for quite a while. And you only need about 1, maybe 2 drops, and that's it. A little bit of the dye goes a long ways. I'm using 11 ounces of the epoxy resin to be able to do this project. I'm also using the white epoxy resin by Resin, and this is a new product. And I'm using this to be able to add the second color into my tabletop. Of course, this is a high gloss, bubble-free, self-leveling, high-impact, heat-resistant, and low-odor product. And with just a drop added, that's going to be beautiful black on that tabletop. We'll mix this now for 3 minutes. So after mixing for 3 minutes and letting it sit for about 5 minutes to get most of the bubbles out, it's time to be able to pour this black epoxy resin onto the tabletops. Now I can just pour this randomly throughout the whole entire area. I want to be able to have good coverage and pretty much equal amounts between the two tabletops. Once I get this done and all poured out, I want to save just a little bit of the resin in my buckets. And I'll be able to show you that reason in a few minutes. But I want the bulk of it onto the tabletops at this point. Next, I'm going to take the white epoxy resin and be able to pour a little bit of that throughout the whole entire top of this board. Now this is just the beginning. There's going to be some more white in a moment, but this is just to get me started. Remember in the beginning, I said there was no special tools required. Well, this is the only tool you need, is your hand, because I'm going to take and now spread this epoxy and blend the white into the black. I'm doing a little bit at this point to be able to get the coverage of the black over the entire surface. I don't want it dripping over the sides yet. But what this does is be able to start to establish the colors between that black and that white. And then when I come back and add some additional white, that is what actually creates some of the depth that you're going to see in this top. I want to pour this resin in kind of a little bit of a diagonal shape to be able to mimic what the natural stone would look like. Again, it's not rocket science. It doesn't have to form a specific pattern, but you do want to be able to create these different lines, which in essence create the veins of the natural stone. Now at this point, you're using a very light touch to be able to spread the epoxy. You want to blend the colors in between the black and the white, and you want to be able to spread it so that it'll start looking like the veins of the natural stone. And if you see areas where you need to have an additional color, go ahead and add it. There is nothing that says that you can't. And what this does, gives you the look of a natural black marble with just the touch of your hand and being able to spread it around. Now as this epoxy begins to self-level, it's also going to be able to move around, and it will create some beautiful patterns that would mimic what the natural stone would look like. Once you have this process done, then you need to start working the edges. You need to be able to help the epoxy roll over the edge, because at this point there's a little bit of surface tension there and it's not allowing it to go over. So by taking your hand and moving that epoxy over to the edge and actually coating the edge with the epoxy, it will allow that epoxy to continue to flow over the edge, again moving that epoxy on the surface and creating some very beautiful patterns. You can see how the epoxy is beginning to run over the edge, but by being able to take my hand and rub it along the edge, that will break that surface tension and be able to start allowing that epoxy to move, and it will drip over onto the sides. If you don't break that surface tension, you'll have a little spot that doesn't have any epoxy on it. And this is why I'll take just a few minutes to rub my hand along the edges to make sure that the epoxy is fully coated. And then you'll see some of that white epoxy start rolling over the sides as well, creating the depth and the look of natural stone. Now at this point, the tops are basically finished. One of the things that I like to be able to do is take it one step further and take the torch and get any little small bubbles that may be in there. Now this is basically a bubble-free resin, but every now and then you still have some little stubborn bubbles that you want to be able to get out. And by being able to use the torch, you can just lightly run over to the surface and pop any minor little small bubbles. And this only takes just a couple minutes to be able to do, and that way you don't have to worry about any little bubbles that may be hanging around. That last little bit of resin that's in the bucket, I can actually take that and work it onto the edges if I need to. In addition to that, if I see an area that needs just a little bit more white, no problem. I can take the white resin and pour it exactly where I want it. You're literally only limited by your own creativity to be able to create the design that you want in this type of a epoxy pour. At this point, it is all finished. It looks fantastic, and I could stop right here and have a beautiful top for my desk. But to be able to take it up one notch higher, I think I'm going to do that. Let me show you what I'm going to do to be able to take this from a beautiful top like this and kick it up a notch higher. And that process is simply taking a few drops of alcohol and sprinkling it onto the surface of this. And what that alcohol does is it disperses that epoxy, and it makes it really pop like the natural stone does. And that alcohol dries in a matter of just a few minutes. And you can see the results of where those drops of epoxy went, and you can see how this looks like a natural black marble top. I think this turned out absolutely gorgeous, and I can't wait for this to dry and get it back onto the desk itself. Very easy technique, and it works fantastic. Now that the tabletop's actually finished, let's turn our attention to the 3D printed drawers. Now this is a drawer that's going to be shallow to hold small parts. It's perfect for what I want. Let me show you how we did this. I started my search on printables.com and I found this drawer by KYZ Design, and it was perfect for what I needed. So I downloaded this file, grabbed some filament off the shelf, loaded it into the 3D printer, and I was ready to hit start. And while this first drawer was printing, I went ahead and decided to print the drawer runners on the other 3D printer. Now this file contains a left and a right, which are interchangeable, and a middle section so that the drawers can actually fit right together. So this is exactly what I was looking for. So the runners are all printed down, and I'm ready to be able to print the second drawer using this printer. Now this particular printer is the smallest one that I have, and if you look at the drawer that's being printed on here, you can see that it is really maxed out to the absolute limit. So quite frankly, I know the limit of this printer now as far as how big of an object that I can print, and this is pretty much it. But it was fun to be able to do because it made it where I could have both drawers finished, and well, not exactly the same time, but fairly close because I had both printers going. But literally after a few hours, the drawers were done, the drawer runners were done, and all I needed to do was finish waiting for that epoxy countertop to be able to completely dry. Well, there you have it. All I have to do now is just finish waiting for that epoxy to dry. But this project is really done, and I had a blast doing it. Being able to use the epoxy resin to be able to take this scrap material and turn it into a beautiful top was exactly what I wanted to be able to do. And having the drawers added to this desk is really going to make it convenient to be able to store those small items that I need to be able to have at hand when I'm working with the different CNC machines. Now you're going to see this desk in a lot of different videos. Pretty much anytime when I'm using the CNC machine, that desk is going to be there. So if you like this video, by all means, give me a thumbs up and hit that little subscribe button right down there. And guys, I can't wait to see you on the next video, whatever that happens to be. So for now, bye-bye everyone. See you real soon.